Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the March meeting of the League of Women Voters of Carrollton, Carroll County. Before we begin the program, I just want to let everyone know that our annual meeting is coming up, and it is going to be April the 16th. So put this on your calendar, save the date. We will be meeting at City Station in room 1 at 9 o'clock in the morning. We have to have a little earlier meeting this year than usual, but we will be sending out further information. So just save the date. And Jennifer also wishes me to remind those of you who have reports to turn in for the annual workbook that she needs to have them. It's getting time, so get them in the next few days if you possibly can. Thank you, and Robin, it's all yours.
Okay, so tonight we have a guest, Chris Joyner. He is an investigative reporter with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where he writes about politics, political extremism, government corruption, and campaign finance. He has degrees in history from University of West Georgia and the University of Southern Mississippi, and he lives in Atlanta right now. Chris worked at the Times-Georgian from 1996 to 1999 as a reporter and editor. But before I begin, I wanted to tell a little bit about how I learned about this murder. So in about 2004, I was introduced to a young woman who claimed to be a psychic. And she came to my house. It was her first few minutes in Carrollton. She was from South Georgia, and immediately said she saw a woman, saw or heard, I don't know how she does that, saw or heard a woman running down my street barefooted. I particularly remember she said barefooted, screaming, "Help, help." And then she was banging on a door and was yelling, "There's been a murder," or something to that effect. And I really had no idea what that meant. So I asked one of the older ladies on my street if they knew anything about it, and they did. And they told me the story and the very basic details of it. Because, you know, I do live on Griffin Drive. And in fact, Nan Turner, the young woman of the couple who was assaulted, Nan Turner did actually run to our street and bang on the door of George Syme, who lived on Griffin Drive at the time. There's just no way this woman could have known anything about this. She was very young and had never even known anything about Carrollton. But so I've been asking people about it for years, and but I found very little detail. So I was really looking forward to reading the book, and now I'm looking forward to hearing from Chris. So Chris, would you please give us a talk about?
Absolutely. And that's a great intro. You know, in a lot of ways, some of you may be familiar with another book that is called The Murder in Coweta County. That in some ways is sort of like the prequel to my book, because it involves many of the same people. And, you know, there's a psychic involved in that story as well, Mahalie Lancaster, who was of great local renown in Carroll County. But I'm so pleased to be talking to you about the 3 death sentences of Clarence Henderson, which has been a project I've been looking into for, really most of my professional career anyway, certainly. Can everybody hear me and see me okay? Excellent. So as we were talking about sort of in the intro, it involves a murder that occurred Halloween night, 1948, when Carl Stevens Jr., whose nickname was Buddy, and his date, Nan Turner, were parking in a car on what was in Sunset Hills Country Club, which was under development at the end of a dead end street that now is Sunset Boulevard. And it was a Wednesday night. It was moonless night. It was kind of rainy, very dark, and a masked man with a flashlight and a gun forced them out of their car and walked them across newly plowed cotton fields and cornfields, up and over 2 fences, and with the intent of sexually assaulting Nan Turner. Buddy Stevens fought with the man and was shot to death while Nan ran for help there to the closest house that she could see, which was at the end of Griffin Drive there, and it was George Syme's house. George Syme being a pretty prominent person in the community. He was head of the service, the Carroll County Service League, and was big in, I believe, the Rotarians. So he was well known. And what happened after that was a manhunt, a roundup of probably more than a dozen people who were potential suspects. Eventually, the police, 18 months later, would connect a sharecropper named Clarence Henderson to the crime through sort of attenuated ownership of the suspected murder weapon. And Clarence Henderson was tried and convicted 3 times. Each time the state Supreme Court would send it back for retrial. I'm assuming that some of you at least have read the book and have had an opportunity to and some of you may already know bits and pieces of the story. This was something that I started looking into when I was a reporter at the Times-Georgian, because I had gone to West Georgia, as had my father and my mother. My father and my mother went to West Georgia in the 1940s. And Dad, and when I got a job working at the Times-Georgian, Dad said, you ought to pull down some of the archives and take a look at the Buddy Stevens murder. He said, that happened after I left West Georgia. He said, but I don't think they ever figured out who did that. And so one day I pulled down the first bound volume of the Georgian, which was the 1948 Georgian, and started looking at it and just became amazed at the story and its many twists and turns. But more than that, I also became convinced that the death of Buddy Stevens and the trials of Clarence Henderson had something to say about that decade after World War II and what life was like both in Carrollton and Georgia, but also across the United States, as we had all this pent up energy from World War II and the Great Depression, but also a lot of anxiety and fear about what the future was going to be like. When I imagined myself writing this book back in the 90s, I kind of thought that the first line was going to be, anything could have changed Carrollton. It just happened to be a murder. It's not the way I ended up writing it, but it is true. Carrollton was on the cusp of changing in pretty dramatic ways. And the murder of Buddy Stevens and the trials of Clarence Henderson really frame that out in the story. But it also, I think, talks a lot about what happened in America during that period. So I don't know whether we want to talk, I'm certainly happy to field questions about it, or just engage in some conversation about the murder and the trials. How would you like to proceed?
Well, however you like. But I think that one thing that the league is probably most interested in is the history of racial relations in Carroll County. That's one thing that we might be interested in. And there was a lot of information you gave about how in the past Ku Klux Klan tried to come and establish, and somehow they couldn't, and the percentage of Black people in Carroll County at the time and things like that. I think that would be.
So, of course, the subhead or the subtitle of the book is Battle for Racial Justice at the Dawn of the Civil Rights Movement, because this is sort of the broader context of the trials. We think about the the most consequential period of civil rights being the mid 50s through the mid 60s, late 60s, as the really, this is when we see, the big massive marches and the Voting Rights Acts and, the career of Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders. But this period in the 1940s, there's an amazing amount of work that's being done on the issues of civil rights by the NAACP and other organizations. And one of the really burning issues for the NAACP was the fact that Black men were constantly being rounded up and accused in crimes that they had very tenuous relationship with. And that certainly is the case with Clarence Henderson. Hold on one tiny second here, because there's something that is, I wanted to, just a technical thing here real quick. Hold on. Sorry to. Yeah. Okay. One thing I wanted to point out as far as the feed goes, and Robin, I think you're pinned here, so everybody is seeing your face, which is fine with me. I just not sure that's exactly what you envisioned.
I think Jennifer can change that.
Yeah. I just don't know whether I don't know if that's the way it appears for everybody else, but I just checked the live feed on YouTube, and it's pretty much okay. It doesn't matter to me.
Excuse me. I can see you, Chris.
Okay. All right. I was just checking the YouTube live feed, and it was looking a little different to me, but it's neither here nor there. So Clarence Henderson, in sort of basic terms, Buddy Stevens is he's a young white man. He's 20, almost 22 at the time of his death. And Nan is white. She's a teenager. She's 19, I think, 18, 19, in that neighborhood. And when she is interviewed initially by the police, she cannot identify the attacker. She did not see him. And this followed a pattern because the attack on Nan and Buddy was actually one in a series of attacks, I believe the sixth, that had occurred over the course of the summer and into the fall, where a serial rapist was stalking couples in Carrollton, scaring off the boy and sexually assaulting his date. It just happened in the case of Buddy Stevens that Buddy had done some time in the military. He was a young, fit man, and he fought with the attacker rather than running, and it ended up with him being killed. Nan told the police she never saw him, but either because this is what she genuinely believed, or whether she was encouraged to believe this because the police had been searching for a culprit, had said that she didn't see him, but he sounded like a, quote, Negro. And so the dragnet then began specifically for a black male suspect. And really police were detaining black men and holding them in secret during that period for months. And so these kind of cases were of real interest to the NAACP because it was a long-standing problem for their constituency, had been for decades, that black men were being accused, particularly in sexual assaults against women or other violent crimes against whites, of being of being the culprit when perhaps they had no connection to the crime. Clarence Henderson, his only alleged connection to the death of Buddy Stevens was that the pistol that was recovered and believed to be used in the crime was said by witnesses to have been in his possession for the period just long enough for him to have committed the crime. One of the things that I found in my research is that firearms were sort of a form of currency. You know, they were always changing hands. People would have them and then sell them, and you know, there was no tracking of those of firearms during that period at all. And so a number of witnesses were called to say that they saw Clarence Henderson with a revolver that matched the description of the revolver that was in evidence, you know, for the period long enough to have killed Buddy Stevens. You know, beyond that, he had no connection with, you know, Buddy or Nan or that area of town or any of the other cases. Yet he was charged and tried and convicted on his first trial in a single day. That trial, from soup to nuts, from opening arguments to the jury verdict, lasted one day in January of 1950. And it was after that it got on the radar of the NAACP. So yeah, the relationship between the white and the black communities in Carrollton and more broadly across the South and the nation are really one of the themes that I look at in the book. And I try to do it in a balanced and even-handed way, recognizing that, you know, all people, black and white, in 1950 didn't have the benefit of being able to look, you know, look ahead. You know, they could only see behind them. They didn't have a vision of the vision of the future that we have. So when I talk about someone like Judge Boykin, who was the Superior Court judge for that trial, or for those trials, I try to understand him as a person in the same way I try to understand Clarence Henderson and the lawyers that are involved.
Thank you for sharing with us this evening. Could you tell us the composition of the jury in the trials?
Yeah, the juries were all white in all three trials. There was, well, I take it back. There was I believe, a black juror in the third trial. And it was during this period that African Americans in Carroll County for the first time began to be called for jury duty. I think that speaks not only about this case, which was very political, but also some broader things that are at work. I've said that if Clarence Henderson had been charged with this crime 10 years earlier or in another part of the state, he might never have seen the inside of a courtroom. But because it was when it was and where it was, he at least had, you know, a semblance of an opportunity to be in, you know, in a courtroom setting and present evidence for his defense. Carrollton and Carroll County, during this period, the politics, particularly in regards to race, were more moderate than in Georgia, generally speaking. It was an anti-Talmadge stronghold, and in fact, going back to, you know, before the Civil War, it had a reputation for being more moderated on issues of race than, you know, maybe you would expect from a Deep South community. So there was that, I guess, benefit for Clarence Henderson, that at least he was, you know, he wasn't going to be subject to mob violence as he might have been someplace else. But also the fact that it takes place after the war, when the United States reluctantly is beginning to deal with, you know, some pressing racial issues. I think then that, you know, I think that's an important part of the story as well. And that's why he ends up being able to go to an all-white Georgia Supreme Court and have those verdicts remanded back for retrial. I think the courts during this period were also beginning to deal for the first time with the idea that the system was skewed inappropriately against particularly against Black criminal defendants.
Was the jury also composed of, oh, I'm sorry, somebody else has their hand up. Sorry.
No, it's all right.
Catherine and John, you have a question?
Yes, Mr. Joyner, thank you for coming. This is very interesting.
Oh, thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about what types of legal support that Clarence Henderson had available at that time? You mentioned 3 trials.
Mhm.
You mentioned the Supreme Court. Sounds like that could have involved quite a bit of attorney fees.
Indeed. And that was a really complicated part of the picture for Clarence Henderson. For his first trial, he was a sharecropper and not coming from, as that would indicate, he's not coming from a lot of money. He was given defense attorneys from the Carroll County Bar. So he had 2 white defense attorneys, well, 2 white attorneys who did criminal defense. One was a state legislator, and the other was a young attorney, William Wiggins. And Wiggins' name is still on a law firm in town in Carrollton. But those 2 attorneys did not mount much of a defense. In that first trial, they made very few objections. They called no witnesses. They didn't call Clarence Henderson's wife, who would have testified that he was home with her that night. They didn't, there was cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses, and they allowed Clarence Henderson himself to make an unsworn statement, which was something you could do back then. Criminal defendants were allowed to take the stand, give a statement, unsworn, and not open themselves up for cross-examination, and the jury would just have to decide whether they believed it or not, knowing that it was not sworn. The second trial, because the first trial ended quickly and then gained notoriety after the verdict, involved he had 3 attorneys, 2 Black attorneys from Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, who were funded by the NAACP, and they brought on a 3rd attorney, a white attorney named Dan Duke, really to be the face of the criminal defense, because again, they were facing an all-white jury, and they felt like they needed a white face really to do the bulk of the the public-facing defense. I don't think, in fact, there was every evidence that Carroll County had never seen a Black practicing attorney in the courthouse before that trial. In fact, a lot of people came out just to see what it looked like. So in that second trial, he had a defense team, but they were still working under a tremendous financial strain. I went to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. to look at the archives of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And, the files on the Clarence Henderson case are largely, can we get this? Can we get this criminal expert? Can we get this much money from the national organization to help fund the defense? And it was a real struggle, because not only was the NAACP trying to help out with the Clarence Henderson defense, but they were working dozens of civil cases across the United States that would eventually become the building blocks for Brown versus Board of Education to attack the separate but equal doctrine in the Supreme Court. So, they had a lot of, and then they also had other criminal cases that were like the Clarence Henderson case. So they had, there's a tremendous amount of financial strain. In fact, to raise money for the defense, the attorneys went to the Black churches in Atlanta, where the pastors asked their congregations from the pulpit for help, financial help for Clarence Henderson in Carrollton. And the third trial was different entirely. Money had run out. They were getting very little help from the NAACP, and Moore and Robinson, the 2 Black attorneys from Auburn Avenue, were engaged in some civil suits for the NAACP and were not available, even if there was money, and there wasn't. And so Dan Duke took that on by himself. And so that third trial was, he just had one attorney, but he had a very good one, an attorney, Dan Duke, who was willing to take the risk of defending a black man accused of killing a white man in the midst of a sexual assault on a white woman. He took his life in his hands in that defense.
Deirdre, did you have another question?
Thank you, Mr. Joyner.
Oh, my pleasure. Deirdre, did you have another question about the jury composition, or? Or I'll take another question.
Yeah, anybody else would. Or
It's like Cheryl has her hand up.
Yes. Back to Dan Duke.
Yes.
Was he a local attorney, or did he come from somewhere else?
He came from Atlanta. He actually grew up in Palmetto, which is in South Fulton County, and was I guess, an associate of Governor Ellis Arnold, who was from Noonan, and worked in the Arnold administration, and then went into private practice. He had designs on a political career. He ran for lieutenant governor. And I've said before, and believe it, that, in a sort of alternate universe, Dan Duke would have been governor of the state of Georgia, or he would have been a congressman. He was very capable. He was named, he had national recognition, particularly for his work in breaking up the Ku Klux Klan when he was a state prosecutor. And he was sort of a man out of his time. He was willing to take these cases. He fought, strongly on the issues of equal treatment under the law for black defendants. And that was not always, obviously, a very popular position for him to take during that period. He would in fact end up becoming a judge in later life with Fulton County, but he was from Atlanta, and the prosecuting attorney made sure that people knew he was not a local attorney. It was he brought with him all of his Atlanta-ness.
Thank you.
One thing I'm wondering is about other organizations that came to Carrollton during the trial to demonstrate or what have you. I believe we talked about, we read about the Communist Party coming. You want to talk a little bit about that?
When I was doing my initial research on this as a young reporter, it was one of the most extraordinary things as I turned the pages of the Georgian and went to the microfilm, is that after the first trial, the first organization to get involved in Clarence Henderson's appeal and defense was the Communist Party of the United States of America. Couldn't believe it. What were the communists doing in Carroll County? But in fact, the communists were very active through the South in the 30s and 40s because they could see that segregation kept a segregated class of citizens, and they felt like that was a really fertile ground for recruitment into the Communist Party through African Americans. In fact, the main communist organizer in the book, Homer Chase, really argued that the only way socialist revolution was going to come to the United States was through the South, and he believed that because he felt like he could organize African Americans. I think it was a misunderstanding of where African Americans stood on the issue of communism. Many had just returned from fighting an extreme political philosophy in Europe and another one in the Pacific, and were not interested in overthrowing the government that they just went to fight for. What they wanted, of course, as civil rights leaders would come to say, is equal treatment in the system that they believed in. But Clarence Henderson, when he was tried and convicted in a single day, he was sentenced to the electric chair. He was going to go to the to death row and await execution. And when the Communist Party showed up and said, we're raising money for your defense, and we have this defense committee, the Hendersons were happy for the help. Ultimately, when the NAACP got involved, the NAACP insisted that the communists, not be involved. The NAACP during this period and going forward took a very hard line on communism because they were worried that their efforts would be tarnished in the Red Scare that was brewing at the time, and that the whole organization would be called communist. Thurgood Marshall, who would become Supreme Court Justice in later life, was head of the NAACP's legal office, and he was insistent that unless the communists receded, the NAACP would not get involved in Henderson's defense. In fact, made Henderson sign a document swearing that there was no communist influence in his defense. But that became a really big part of this drama for Carrollton. Judge Boykin held hearings where he brought in the communist organizers in the state and their associates. It was a criminal contempt hearing. He locked people up. It was going on at the same time that there were national trials of communist leaders. So it wasn't going on in a vacuum. This was something that was happening around the nation. It was in the consciousness. And of course, the Korean War had just broken out as well. So it was a very politically charged atmosphere. And, there were lots of people in Carrollton who were very exercised about the idea that communists were, there on Dixie Street, and there was a brawl between some Carrollton boys and Homer Chase out in front of the courthouses, as Homer Chase had come in to hear his contempt charge. So it was very dramatic. And and I think one of the more interesting parts of the book is how Henderson and his defense team negotiated this.
So there were a lot of people who related, like for instance, Judge Boykin's brother was a lawyer for the prosecution.
Right. Judge Boykin's older brother, Samuel Boykin, is the judge, and his older brother Shirley was appointed as a special prosecutor by the solicitor, our modern day district attorney, to prosecute the case alongside the solicitor, Wright Lipford. There are so many things really about the courtroom aspects of this story that are sort of a little unbelievable by modern standards. Like, for instance, the first trial was held with dozens of armed state patrol troopers ringing that massive. If you've been in the courtroom in the old courthouse, you know how big that courtroom is. They had dozens of armed state troopers flanking the walls. Gave the appearance of it's almost like a military tribunal. And of course, Shirley Boykin being prosecutor, we can't even sort of fathom that today. How would the brother of the judge be the prosecutor? How would that, how could that be fair? And the Communist Party, when, they made a lot of hay out of that, and raised money in New York and Chicago for their cause on the backs of, of this Carroll County scene. And so it's sort of remarkable. Now, there are also other aspects that we wouldn't really recognize as well, like the defense did not have access to all the prosecution's evidence. Those Supreme Court verdicts that would make the discovery process more transparent had not happened yet. And the black attorneys at one point were threatened by the solicitor that they couldn't talk to his witnesses. and, in preparing their defense, and threatened to, threaten them with bodily harm if they tried. So there were a lot of, there was a lot of things about, about the prosecution that just, were, had the cards stacked against Clarence Henderson. It's one of the things that makes it even more remarkable, really, in my mind, that he made it as far as he did in this process.
It's interesting to me because as I'm reading the book, I know people related to people who were back in the day. And, so I would put the book down and then go and call them and ask them, what they thought about it and things like that. But lots of people, related. It was a small town at the time. It was
Really
a very
was.
small town.
Small town with really big visions for itself. And, I went to West Georgia, in the late 80s, early 90s, and then came back in the late 90s to be a reporter. So I had an idea of the character of Carrollton and Carroll County and covering it and being in government meetings. So, it's really something that's always been in Carrollton's DNA. I mean, Carrollton really sees itself as a community apart. It's, it has grand visions for, how it can develop even today, and part of that is having the college. Part of that is having employers like Southwire. And part of it is just, I think, in its DNA, it's sort of like a frontier village. It's really, it is a place that is sort of a special character. For those of you that are reading, I'm trying to take pains as I describe it, because I realize some of you may be in different parts of the story and may not have completed the book. But, in the second chapter is devoted entirely to Carroll County's history from its settlement up to the time of the murder, because I really felt like for readers, unlike y'all, for readers who don't know where Carrollton is and don't have a sense of it, it's a real character in the book, and it's important to understand that character if you're going to understand what happens in the coming chapters.
To a certain degree in Carrollton, I see a conflict between people who want to be progressive, who want to progress as a city and be modernized, and people who do not want to modernize because more people might come here.
It is entirely the conflict after World War II. I mean, a lot, and frankly, don't we see this nationally? That there's a real conflict nationally between our desire to progress and for, to make progress on different issues, and also our fear of what that might mean. What do we risk? What do we give up? If certain groups get power, do other groups lose power as a result? And, and that sort of tension was very present after World War II in Carrollton and elsewhere. What was that? If Blacks want more freedoms and civil rights, what does that mean for the white community? If Buddy Stevens can, if we're going to have a modern society and we're going to be more connected with the outside world, and Buddy Stevens gets killed, is that the trade-off? These were real, sort of existential questions. Carroll County and Carrollton had a history of violence. It was not a placid place from its founding, but the kind of violence that Carrollton and Carroll County that they were used to was, a man kills his neighbor, over an argument. People who've known each other all their lives get into a fight and one of them dies. That kind of violence that you could explain, but random street violence, real whodunit. And then you throw in racial elements and, sexual elements. It becomes even more difficult. And so there's Ken. Is that Ken Denny? I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Hey, Chris, how you
Hey,
doing?
Ken, I'm doing good. So you're going to get to the whodunit of who killed Buddy Stevens. Well, it's not. I think the evidence would show today that Clarence Henderson did do it.
Did you said didn't.
Did not. I think if you, as you read and look at particularly the second and the third trials, you'll see that the state's case unravels in two distinct ways. And I'm not going to give that much away, but when I was writing the book, I was like, I've got three trials, basically the same evidence. How am I not going to be writing the same chapters over and over again? But each trial has a very distinct character, and the defense goes after the state's case in separate ways, and particularly in the second and third trial. So the trial chapters are all very sort of unique from each other. So yeah, there's no evidence that Clarence Henderson killed Buddy Stevens. The evidence that's presented didn't even stand up at the time to the Supreme Court scrutiny. And that's the Georgia Supreme Court. It's not the U.S. Supreme Court. It didn't get up to Washington. This was in Atlanta, where there were real pressures. Some of the things that I think mitigate Clarence Henderson's guilt is it's going to be hard for a Black man in 1948 to skulk around in wide areas of Carrollton without being seen. And Clarence Henderson would have had to have done it on foot. So I don't know how that would have even happened. It would have been a pretty poor plan. There was real concern about the taxi industry in Carrollton during that period, that it was linked to the attacks, and that it was also linked to some other sort of like nefarious things like drug smuggling and things like that. Taxis were a primary way to get around in Carrollton at the time, because you remember coming out of World War II, a lot of rationing had kept people from buying cars, and so if you wanted to get around, you might get in a taxi. One of the taxi drivers that shows up in the book, I think, makes a compelling possible suspect. 70 years from that event, it's hard for me to say who did it, and really sort of aside from the point, it's less a whodunit and more of a why did it happen, as far as the book goes.
Yes, I do see that, but I keep thinking about the flashlight. And can you tell the connection between the person that we think might have done it and why they would have had that specific flashlight?
Well, I mean, the person, the taxi driver we're talking about is Leonard Pendergrass, and he's connected to the crimes in some pretty significant ways. One of which is that the gun that was used to shoot Buddy Stevens was his gun. Now he claims it was stolen off of a friend of his in a separate attack that occurred earlier. That he had loaned it out, it had been stolen, it went through various hands, and that Clarence Henderson ended up owning it. The flashlight itself, he had been a Carrollton police officer, and he had been a sheriff's deputy, and that might be standard equipment for a police officer. Could also be standard equipment for a taxi driver, but certainly I think the gun is a central piece of evidence in the book, and it is attached to Leonard Pendergrass. Now, does that mean Leonard Pendergrass did it? I don't know, because the gun evidence itself is highly questionable.
Well, in the first 6 attacks, or maybe the first 5 attacks, you point out in the book that the Carrollton police and the sheriff's department did not basically do anything at all.
Well, the GBI had been called in, and they were working the case, but there were clearly some confusing aspects to the case. There was no description of the suspect. From some victims, there seemed to be some confusion as to what crime had been committed. Um, we know the most detail about the case the assault that immediately preceded Buddy Stevens' murder, because it comes up in evidence. And that was clearly a sexual assault that matched the pattern that they were talking about. But even in that one, there was no claim that they saw the attacker. So it is a very strange series of attacks. And I think it's worth noting that there's never an attempt to associate Clarence Henderson with any of the other ones. You talk about knowing people in Carrollton who are descendants. So I've done several readings of the book. I did a reading at Horton's, and I hope to come back and do another style of reading at Underground when the weather straightens out. And that reading at Horton's, not only did I have people asking me about street names and where did something happen, and sort of testing my knowledge of local geography, but I had people who were like, my father or my grandfather was on one of the grand juries, or I was I heard this story when I was a young kid, or my aunt was in the courtroom when the verdict came down. And I had also a nephew of Nan Turner, the woman who was assaulted. He was at the reading and had me sign some books. Real people. I've done readings now in Atlanta where members of the Henderson family have shown up and contacted me ahead of time, and then come and talked about how that story impacted their lives and how really little they knew about it, because the Hendersons relocate to Metro Atlanta at the end, after all the events of the book, and that's a decent sized family. There's lots of grandchildren and great grandchildren who are around, and even one of Clarence Henderson's daughters is still alive. And it's this history was not something that they had available to them prior to this book being published, because it was not something that was talked about, except in very broad terms of, we had to leave Carroll County, that kind of way. So it's been a very interesting, and it's instructive when you write nonfiction. These are real people. These are real people.
So I'd like you to talk a little bit about Stanley Parkman, who I think is, to a certain degree, a hero in the story, if there is one.
He is, and I do try to stay away sometimes from hero and villain in the story, because people are complicated, but there are people who act heroically, and Stanley Parkman acts heroically. He was someone who and he's also one of the few people that I personally knew who was still around. He was, he was writing a weekly column for the Times-Georgian when I was a young reporter, and he would come in and he had an office, and I would go back and talk to him. I talked to him about this case because when I started getting interested in it, and it was great to be able to think about that. When I started writing a few years ago, it was great to be able to have those notes and to think about that, those conversations as I was writing. But Stanley Parkman was young and had been staked to a new newspaper, the Georgian, by powerful business interests in the community who had essentially said, we don't like the current newspaper, which was the Times Free Press, and we need a paper that's more invested in the community, and we will give you your startup money, and then we will allow you to buy us out. And with the idea being, you will be a, pro Carrollton newspaper, boosterish. And he was, everything about the Georgian, for many, many years. And in fact, into the Times-Georgian period when I was working there, was very geared towards, boosting Carrollton's, civic image. But when Buddy Stevens was killed, it was a real, come to Jesus moment for Stanley Parkman. He had known about the prior attacks and had not put them in the newspaper because the police had asked. And here now it was somebody who was dead. And if he had sounded the alarm with what he knew, maybe Buddy Stevens would have been alive. Maybe people wouldn't have been parking at these, Lover's Lane areas where these attacks were happening.
Did he actually say that?
Yeah. Well, and he does, in fact, in a call. I mean, the greatest, the bravest thing I think that he does in the book is immediately tells his readers, I knew this was going on and I didn't put it in the newspaper and I should have, and now a boy is dead. And he, I think that really weighed heavily on him. Now he remembers it many years later. I think, it's 50 years on when I first talked to him about it, as a, probably the biggest story of his career in journalism. And that it was a very white knuckle moment when he realized I've got to come clean in the pages of the paper with what I knew and when I knew it, and tell people they need to, take care. Their kids are in danger. And that's, I think that is a brave thing for a reporter, journalist to do, is publicly say, here's how I messed up and here's what you need to know about it. That's tough.
So another hero in the book is actually Buddy Stevens' mother. And as women, I think perhaps she should tell us a little bit about why she was a hero. She was a spokesperson for the family and spoke.
She really was. Yeah. And Buddy was her only child. And her husband was, deeply involved in the community with the local service organizations. He was a city clerk.
Kiwanis.
He was with the Kiwanis. But when they go to the city council, they're called to, come talk to the city council about this experience. And she bravely says, look, you guys have mishandled the investigation into my son's death. This is before there have been any arrests made, and months have passed. And she is, speaking for the family very bravely about, things like professionalizing the police force and getting proper training and, learning how to handle evidence and things like that, which would become real issues in later trials. As to how the evidence was handled, the chain of custody and those kind of things. So she was, very brave in the face of losing her only child.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Chris, this has been very, very interesting. Before you leave us, though, I'd like for you to talk a little bit about your work with the AJC in your political reporting and what challenges that have brought to you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm on the investigative staff. Oh, I'm sorry. Cheryl does have her hand up, though.
Let's go to Cheryl.
Am I on? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to tell you how much, how engaging your book is. I grew up in Carrollton. I was born in Carrollton in 1946. So all of this happened during my lifetime. And there's so many things in your book, and I haven't finished it yet, that I never knew about Carrollton. I never knew about the violence. I didn't know that Carrollton was such a tough town.
Oh, yeah.
It was when I was living there. I just didn't get exposed to it. But I've learned so much about my hometown from this one book. So I just wanted to thank you. It's very well written, and it's certainly engaging. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, that means everything to me, and I really appreciate it. I felt like it was an important story to tell, but I certainly wanted it to be enjoyable to read, and not like just medicine, not like a, dry history book or whatever. I wanted it to be a narrative that was, you could get something out of. So, looks like Ken, it says Ken wants to know about the connections between this and the Coweta County murder. I'm looking to see, do I have the book handy? Murder in Coweta County.
One of the things was Lamar Potts.
Yeah, Lamar
did a lot of
Potts.
things.
Yeah, Lamar Potts was the sheriff of Coweta County and is the hero in the murder in Coweta County. He's the one honest man who was willing to go after a powerful white landowner from Meriwether County, so powerful that, Meriwether County was known as the kingdom to people from West Georgia because of the power Wallace had over, the commerce and the politics of that area. And Lamar Potts went after him when Wallace killed a white farmhand. And he gained a lot of notoriety at the time, and then even more when Murder in Coweta County was written, and probably even more when Johnny Cash played him in a TV movie. Other people who are shared in this story, because as the Wallace trial wraps up, it wraps up right around the same time that Buddy Stevens is killed. So it moves, in 1948 from that story to that in the same judicial circuit, the Coweta judicial circuit, which Carrollton's in with Coweta County. And so the same judge, Sam Boykin, was the judge for the Coweta County case. Wright Lipford, who was the solicitor, plays a role in the latter part of the Coweta County case. The head of the crime lab, who was pivotal in both cases for forensic evidence. So yeah, there's a lot of shared DNA. It's a little mixed up. Everybody plays sort of a different role in this case. Maybe Sam Boykin doesn't appear as such a, judicial hero as he does in the Wallace case. Lamar Potts is essentially a jailer, and a little more in my story. He is holding Clarence Henderson, and he's also holding several other black men. And Wright Lipford, the solicitor, and Rada Threadgill, who's the chief of police for Carrollton, are essentially taking black men out of the Carrollton community and secretly hiding them in the Noonan jail for interrogation purposes. And so, it's, where these characters are really heroic. In the case of Coweta County, they're, perhaps less so in my book. It's a different context, though, obviously. And sorry, there was another one. Oh, the GBIs are investigating. No, they weren't called down to Coweta County. The rapes that occur in 1948. The Wallace case has already gone through its initial trial, and there are appeals, but the GBI is done with its investigation by that point. But there is a case. The GBI is called off the case in Carrollton, and is they're reassigned after they make an initial arrest. Because Clarence Henderson wasn't the first person they arrested; they had another suspect, and the GBI is called off after that arrest. And when they do not bring that suspect to trial, the local, Rotarians and the Kiwanis are writing to the governor and saying, we need the GBI back in here. And in fact, they get the GBI. The book is available locally. It's available. I think there are still signed copies at Underground off the square. Hortons may have, I don't know that they have signed copies at Hortons, but they do have signed book plates. I signed a bunch of book plates.
It's also on Audible. And how in the world did you get Ben Affleck to do your book on Audible?
Ben Affleck doesn't do my book on Audible, but a really nice reader who's done a lot of great things does the book, does the audio for the book. He is not from around here, as we say, so you have to excuse that. Perhaps he's never heard of Villa Rica, so he might not know how to say it. He's never been to Buckhannon, so. And, so you just have to give him a a little bit of grace when he gets around to pronouncing some place names, and maybe doesn't even say some names the way we might.
Sure.
But and his voice is, you could hear him read the phone book. He's got a great voice.
Yeah. Actually, it sounded a little bit like you. So I really am not going to be satisfied until you tell us a little bit about your challenges at the AJC.
Sure. No, happy to do it. I'm on the investigative staff at the AJC. Those of you who subscribe, or those of you who don't, but read it online, one thing you should know about your state newspaper is we have an extraordinarily large and robust investigative staff. I'm one of 8 investigative reporters. You are not going to find a paper the size of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that has that many trained investigative reporters on staff. We have 2 editors, and we have 2 data reporters that are assigned to us as well. So it's a really big part of what we do. And while we're all sort of generalists, meaning we all do different kinds of things, I've always been attached to the politics team. So I do a lot of political reporting. In the past, that's meant I've done deep dives on lobbying at the state capitol, tax reform, campaign finance issues, ethics reform in the General Assembly. But starting in around 2015, I became increasingly concerned with what I saw as a really robust fringe on the extreme right. Now, I'm not talking about the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or anything that we would recognize as traditional politics, but I'm talking about white supremacists and white nationalists, militias, people who are really operating outside the normal bounds of politics. That would include a group like the Base that had a cell up in Rome where they were plotting the murder of some people in Cartersville, while working ultimately for the downfall of our American system of government. This is the aim of a lot of these groups. So I became increasingly concerned that these groups had found new strength particularly after the massacre at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston in 2015. And those of you that might recall that time period, after that mass shooting in Charleston, there was a reaction on the part of a lot of Southern politicians to take down the Confederate battle flag where it was still flying. And that super energized a segment of the extreme right. They saw it as an issue they felt they could recruit around, much in the same way in my book, the communists felt they had an issue that they could recruit around. In this case, the Confederate iconography that, in monuments and markers and flags and place names has been a really powerful recruiting tool online for extreme right-wing groups. And so I've been writing about those groups as they've developed and as we've had to deal with them as they try to intrude on our mainstream politics. As we saw a year ago at the U.S. Capitol, there was an animated group that broke into the Capitol and tried to stop the certification of the election. These were not the people I'm talking about. These, by and large, were politically active conservatives, but the conversation that was happening to their right in these extreme fringes was bleeding into their consciousness in a big way. The people pushing the idea that the election was stolen began pushing it years before the election. The QAnon conspiracy theory is part of that. Something called the Great Replacement theory is part of that, where, there's a conspiracy to replace white people with minorities and immigrants, is all part of the kinds of things that are sort of tried out online and in these sort of dark recesses of the internet, The arguments are boiled down and honed and then sort of unleashed on us in ways that we don't expect. And that it sort of infects our society in a way that I think has unpredictable results. And I think, part of that is what we saw on January 6th is sort of the result of that. So that's some of what I do. I actually spend quite a great deal of time doing for the AJC. And I also would say, I don't just look at the extreme right as well. I also look at the extreme left, which also has become more robust in recent years, although not nearly as well organized as the right has had a tendency to be. But I'm actually working on a story right now about a revolutionary group in Atlanta that's been causing a lot of problems. So I'm not exclusively on one extreme. I think that the extreme groups on either side that wish to dismantle our society are worth at least talking about and understanding. That's some of what I do.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been so interesting. And I really hope that as a political writer that perhaps we can get you to talk to the state league at an event.
Oh, I'm happy to.
Yeah, you're really a great speaker and we so appreciate. And that's over and out for us.
Thank you so
go
much.
Out and buy the book.
Yes, please do. Buy the book. Tell your friends. All right. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure being here.